Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The issue of climate change has once again taken the headlines as China and the US issued a joint statement last week to further cooperate on tackling climate change and to make greater efforts to bolster green energy. Earlier, I spoke with Mia Amor Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados, on the sidelines of the 6th Paris Peace Forum, who is calling on all countries to help save the planet and make the world a better and more hospitable place. And in the second half of our program, I will also show our exclusive interview in Paris with Ernesto Ottoni, Assistant Director General for Culture of UNESCO. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue, Prime Minister. I know you are one of the high-profile advocates against climate change, if not the most high-profile champion against climate change. Tell us, where are we now in terms of the fight against climate change?
We have made some progress. The question is it enough, and are we moving fast enough? We're not moving fast enough because in many instances what we're talking about are steps before we can succeed. Mm-hmm. We need capital, we need access to money, whether it is public money, private money, in order to develop the projects. And before we can develop the projects, once we have the money, we need to do feasibility studies, because for those things that we want to do to adapt to a new climate, increasing sea levels, floods, etc., very often they require feasibility studies. So when you consider the life of a project, you realize that we are really not around the corner from where we need to be, and therefore we need urgently to settle all of the financing and funding issues. Then we need to be able to settle the issue of access to products. Mm-hmm. As much as I want to be able to have electric vehicles, we don't have enough in our part of the world. As much as we want to be able to move to more photovoltaic farms, we don't have enough battery storage for grid stability. Mm-hmm. And that's because of the fact that there are not enough companies producing the different types of batteries that are needed. So there are real challenges at a granular level that cause us to wonder whether capacity is there to meet the commitments that we've made. Having said that, we're much further than we were 10 years ago. But that is that doesn't help us, because at the end of the day, we need to be in a position not just to have funding or have product, but to have them all executed so that all human beings can adapt in one sense to what the new temperatures are going to be, but still fight to contain the temperatures, mm-hmm. Still fight to make sure that we do everything to mitigate, and in particular do a pact to be able to bring down the methane emissions, because that's the quickest way to keep us within the 1.5 or just thereabout. And we hope we can make it, because it'll make the difference between whether countries can stay and exist in certain parts of the world, or whether people will have to move and go to other regions.
Speak of that, your country, the so-called small island nations, is one of the countries that is most vulnerable to climate change. How serious is the situation now?
Well, we see the difference. Right now, as I said, the first 6 months of this year, our rainfall average was 50% of what the 30-year average was. The last 3 months of this year, we've seen water and floods like we don't normally see, and the ground is saturated, which affects farmers, it affects communities, it affects the flooding that's taking place. So we are really into what I call the season of superlatives. The hottest, the wettest, the driest, the coldest, everything is breaking new temperatures. When I went to Beijing earlier this year, it was the hottest day in Beijing for 78 years.
Extreme weathers.
Exactly. Yeah. So that is, we're definitely seeing the change in patterns in the last 2 to 3 years.
Mm-hmm. And there is an idea, some media call it radical idea, which is called the Bridgetown Initiative, yep. And your your government. Tell us more about that. What is the Bridgetown Initiative?
Bridgetown Initiative is an attempt to make our financial institutions and our ability to access finance relevant to the times in which we live. Many of these institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, were formed when our countries didn't even exist. Not only do we now exist, but we're facing literally serious times where we are being forced to choose between money spent for adaptation and money spent for development. Money spent for mitigation, money spent to be able to boost our economic competitiveness. And that is a false construct. And in fact, when we met here in Paris, they took the elements of the Bridgetown Initiative and came up with the Paris Pact for People and Planet, which says that, look, you can't ask us to choose between the planet and income inequality or lack of development. And the Bridgetown Initiative basically is about, therefore, expanding access to money for countries, whether it is public money or private money, recognizing why is it that private money doesn't move to the global south. What are the reasons? Is it foreign exchange risk? Is it unconscious bias? How can we get more capital flows to the global south in a way that does not disenfranchise the citizens of the global south? So these things are front and center with the Bridgetown Initiative. We've seen some progress. We've seen the IMF, for example, establish a Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which provides long-term capital for the first time to middle-income vulnerable countries, 20-year money with a 10.5-year moratorium. We've seen the fund be successful in getting other countries to be able to help capitalize that Resilience and Sustainability Trust, while also expanding the capital of the Poverty and Growth Trust so that low-income countries are not disadvantaged while we help middle-income countries who are vulnerable. And we also, in the Bridgetown Initiative, called for a just industrial strategy. I just spoke to you about the goods and the components necessary for us to move to net zero that we simply don't have access to, because all of the production is concentrated in certain parts of the world, and therefore the access is not there. And countries like mine, when we put in our orders, they say, you're too small. We can't focus on you now. We focus on the big orders.
On the initiative, it's said that for rich nations, their access to financing is easier, like 1 to 4% in terms of the interest rate.
Exactly.
But for developing countries, it could be like a 14%.
Look at Glasgow. In Glasgow, we made the big announcement for the JETP projects in South Africa. It's not been able to get off the ground because the cost of capital is multiple times more expensive in South Africa than it would be in Europe or North America.
Yes, yes. And so in terms of that, for the next step, and you talked about the lack of products, the lack of financing, you also are calling for the reform of the global financial institutions. You talked about the IMF.
Well, the reform is there, and that, I just pointed out what the IMF has done to address not just the symptoms, but the causes of the problem with the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. We've also seen them now agree to appoint a new director from Africa, a third director, so that the voices of the world need to be more represented, and we've seen the IMF take those decisions. I'm also hopeful that with the new leadership at the World Bank, with AJ Banga, that we'll begin to see the changes. When we were last in Paris, he announced the use of debt pause clauses, so that when a country is hit by a crisis, that it can pause the payment of its debt for 2 years to give itself the fiscal space in the room to help the country rebuild, especially since there's a large percentage of underinsurance and uninsurance in countries now, simply because many of the risks are uninsurable, and insurance companies may not be willing to go in, as they've announced in California with underwriting risk for fire. So this is more and more going to be necessary, these debt pause clauses, to give countries a space to be able to concentrate on those who have lost homes and those whose families have lost members in the recovery after a crisis. And the other thing we're calling for is longer term money at cheaper rates, because we need to be able, as I said at the beginning, to concentrate not just on adaptation and mitigation for climate, but on education, on healthcare, on fighting crime, on boosting recreational activity, on boosting economic competitiveness. These things all call for money. We need all of the countries of the world to help fight to save the planet. And we need all of the countries of the world to help make the world a better and more hospitable place for people. There can be nothing gained by war, there can be nothing gained by conflict, and there can be nothing gained by not working together. And whether you are at war or you are in conflict or you are not working together, we need to be able to have a course correction. Because if ever the world needed the majority of the countries and the majority of the people to stand up and to help save humanity and the planet, it is now. So I hope that President Xi and President Biden will come to an understanding as to how they can work together to be able to help save the planet and to create more development opportunities for those countries that are currently marginalized. History demands of them now to step up to save the planet, along with India, along with Europe, along with Africa, along with all the small states of the world, Latin America as well, Asia Pacific. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you
All
for
the
your
best.
time, Mr. Prime Minister. Yeah.